We are representatives of the Social Media Data Group, which is basically a working group that looks at exploring data that's scraped from different social media platforms. So we visualize that data, analyze that data, and it really gives us an opportunity to learn about different software and programming skills, but also to apply a digital humanities lens to some areas that mostly attract data studies and social sciences. So I'm Sarah Walton. I'm a PhD student in English. And then Michael?
I'm Michael. I'm a former undergraduate, recently graduated, and I did information science and cultural studies, and I've worked on the social media data group for about a year now on the former project, and then we transitioned to this project.
And I'm Irene Newman. I'm a PhD student in American Studies. I've also been with this team for almost a year. And we're going to start by talking about actually our former project to give you some background. So our last project was focused on Twitter. We looked at social media activism and a particular hashtag that was used during a years-long fight on our campus to take down a Confederate statue, and how the online conversation mirrored violence and conflict in our own town. And for our next project, we were interested in image-based analysis. We wanted to explore a digital space that wasn't dedicated to the news or current events. And so as we start to introduce this Pinterest project, we thought we'd mirror some of our initial conversations that we had for y'all. So when we began to consider Pinterest, we started pulling up our own Pinterest homepages and comparing what those look like. So Pinterest has 3 essential functions. One is search, where users just search for content. The second is pin, where users can save content to either public or private boards, which allows them to curate this content for reference later. And then the third is your homepage, which is recommended content that's specific to an individual's interest or activity. This is my homepage, a screenshot of my homepage. My individual Pinterest usage is pretty sporadic, and it's fed by content that Pinterest is already really known for. So that includes planning bachelorette and bridal parties and other kind of wedding events, getting ideas for specific paint colors or hardware combinations in terms of home remodeling, and a general holding place for recipes. So some of the questions that I had about my homepage were around recommendations that were stage of life. So I also get a lot of content in my homepage that is around baby showers, and it's unclear to me if that's because I was searching bridal showers 2 years ago, or if because of my demographic, Pinterest thinks that that's something I'd also be interested in.
So on my homepage, you can see it looks visually very different. With the colors are very different and the fonts are very different. And I also use Pinterest very differently. So I've used Pinterest a lot for artistic inspiration. And then I've also been recently using it for home design and decor inspiration. But generally, I identify very more masculine. So you can see the colors are generally more masculine and the fonts are very different, and you can see it kind of appealing to my identity in a way, and that's very different than what we've seen before.
This is my homepage. Mostly just wanted to show it to confirm what Michael was just saying, that Irene and I seem to have a very different experience of what is put on our homepages than Michael does. You can see that some of the pins that they're recommending have a more effeminate kind of font. You can see that in the How to DIY bookcase, the fresh peach margaritas. But interestingly, the content itself is not gendered per se. It's merely just the presentation of that content. I mean, recipes are recipes. So we are kind of interested in how this content is being mediated in the visual form, whether or not you might see the same recipes presented to you differently, depending on your own kind of identity and what Pinterest knows about you. And then I just want to reiterate what Irene was saying, where there seems to be maybe a little bit of a time lag. So if there was something that you were searching for quite a bit 4 or 5 years ago, you might still get results on your homepage that kind of connect to that search from 4 or 5 years ago. And it's unclear whether that's just because they're holding on to your data in your previous search terms, or whether they're sort of making assumptions about your stage of life or your demographics. So maybe all of the weddings that you attended were 4 years ago and they're no longer relevant, but they still feel like, well, you're in this age bracket, or you're, whatever, your geographic location or something makes us feel as though this content is still applicable to you. So there's a little bit of the kind of unknown on exactly why they're generating this content for you. Certainly on a time scale, it's a little unclear. So I want to kind of take a step back and talk about identity and social media kind of writ large, so that we can be on the same page in terms of how we're thinking about what Pinterest is doing specifically in terms of identity formation. So first, we would just want to acknowledge that, of course, identity is extremely complex. It's unstable. It's susceptible to a lot of forces, both inside and outside the individual. And that's true offline as well as online. But we wanted to bring up that, of course, social media and other technological shifts have introduced a host of new questions and ways of interpreting identity. And that's constantly changing as the technology changes. So the biggest thing that I kind of wanted to mention that I thought would be relevant is that it seems as though people's experience of community is different online versus offline. So that the way that communities are forming in online spaces tends to have more to do with individual interests than with shared goals. So it's not so much that the individual gets sort of subsumed into community goals or interests, like, oh, we're a sports team that wants to win this championship, or we're a group that's interested in promoting philanthropy, or whatever. That might be happening offline, but online, what's important is I'm a fan of this sports team, you're a fan of this sports team, that's why we're talking to each other. But those discrete nodes of individuality never quite blur. They always remain at least relatively static. And so I think this study does a particularly good job of giving us a definition of that. They say that so far in different studies that have been done, it seems like adolescents and college students tend not to express feelings of group membership with their social network site community. Rather, they describe their experience as one of individuals operating within personalized webs of connections. So again, those nodes that remain kind of visible even once it's in that community form. So how do we kind of establish these nodes or these individual kind of identities online? Well, there's a range of doing that with text, of course, your username, what information you choose to share about yourself. But a lot of times people turn to visual markers. And one obvious place would be the selfie. And there's been a lot of studies on how selfies are being used to kind of subvert or create new identities. But there are other images that circulate that could potentially act as markers or signals of identity. And those include things like memes, Tumblr, posts, pins from Pinterest, even the advertisements that appear on your homepage. All of these things can kind of work together to demarcate particular individual identities. We'll come back to this idea that that can be problematic. Since the visual is so important on social media spaces, some recent scholarship has kind of pushed that we start thinking about them a little bit on their own terms. So in other words, we need to be thinking more about the fact that we have text, which constitutes its own medium and demands its own set of analyses and rhetorical approaches, right? And then we also have images, which demand its own set of rhetorical approaches. So some people are calling for adopting more of kind of the language and methodologies from the visual arts to think about how these things might be working together. There's a tendency to kind of go snap directly to a social, cultural, or political analysis of what these things are doing. But we do need to think about the fact that they are composed visually, and that they're making use of those components as part of their sort of general rhetorical argument. So let's see. So we have both the textual and the visual happening together. I think we all know this. I'm just going to articulate it so that we've said it. You can do kind of whatever you want with those mediums to create an identity that may or may not have a strong relationship with your offline identity. So you can create an entirely anonymous persona. You can maybe use digital spaces as a way to explore new identities that you're interested in, or perhaps to establish an identity that you feel like actually speaks to your own personal, interests and desires more than perhaps your offline self does. So there's a lot of kind of opportunities for play and personal expression, which is maybe a good thing. But there's also a lot of opportunity for people to perpetuate reductive and exclusive identity-based stereotypes. There's a lot of opportunity for gatekeeping and exclusivity based on a fairly narrow range of markers. So if you're only working with, certain set of images and maybe a little bit of text, it's quite easy to say, well, that person seems to be, a white middle-aged woman from, middle America, and I'm going to make this set of assumptions about them accordingly, whether or not people can lose sight of the fact that that might not even actually be what describes this person, let alone that doesn't provide the nuance that you might need to actually make assumptions about who they are as people. And so, as we all know, online spaces can become really toxic. And they seem to be rife with kind of misogyny and racism and homophobia and all kinds of things that are connected to this idea that identity can be kind of detached from reality, that it can be that your actions when you're in this semi-anonymous space can be consequence-free. And so people feel as though they can express maybe even more extreme opinions than they might in an offline space. And so more and more scholars are calling for applying kind of more strict feminist or racially conscious theoretical lenses to how we're analyzing these spaces. Rather than taking them at face value, we need to think about specifically how language is being used to perpetuate violence or to be threatening or to create these toxic atmospheres. So you would think with all of this toxicity that people would maybe just avoid it, especially people in marginalized groups. But I wanted to bring up that recent Pew Research shows, based on looking at the demographics of these online platforms, that it's really a very diverse space. And that in some cases, we actually see these spaces are a majority women or female users or female identifying users. So despite the fact that the language might seem to be extremely toxic and kind of misogynist, that's not necessarily corresponding with the users in these spaces. And I think Irene can speak a little bit more to how Pinterest is divided specifically. But I just wanted to draw your attention to there is a bit of a skew. So at this point, I've been talking a lot about user behavior and user interaction in terms of how identity is constructed online, but that is not the only factor. It might not even be the most important factor in determining how identity is read and constructed. We need to think about how social media spaces themselves, the structure of these spaces, perpetuate either toxic environments or just identity-based biases. So we need to think a little bit about machine learning, about artificial intelligence, about the things that are kind of happening behind the curtain to give you content that is shaped a certain way or that looks a certain way, depending on the platform that you're using. I don't want to get too into this particular study because we don't have time, but I just kind of wanted to very briefly talk about machine learning when we're talking about reading images. So I'm not going to say it's easy because I wouldn't know how to do it, but people have figured out how to teach a computer how to read images that are of objects pretty well. So a computer can be taught to recognize that this is a tree, that's also a tree, even though they may look very different. They might be different heights. One might have pine needles, the other might have leaves. It might be different times of year, all kinds of things that could potentially trip up any kind of AI. Over time, they've done a good job of getting it to kind of move past that and with a really low margin of error, identify objects. But it becomes quite a bit more complicated when you're trying to apply labels to people. And there's a whole host of reasons why that might be. But one potential issue is that at some point, somebody, some human being, had to come up with a dictionary of terms, of labels that can be applied to pictures of human beings. And that dictionary of terms is then kind of circulated through whatever AI, right, to apply to images. And it kind of, it's not that we lose control of it, but it can reach a point where it's identifying photos incorrectly, or it's using language that we might find extremely problematic. And you can see that with the list that I put at the bottom of this slide.